I knew something was wrong the moment I saw my daughter-in-law step into that quiet little restaurant on Elmwood Street. It was a Tuesday night in early October, the kind of crisp New England evening that usually made me grateful for warm lights and linen tablecloths. But the look on her face erased whatever comfort I had hoped for. Her name was Sienna, 28 years old, petite, striking in a sharp way that made people stare twice, yet somehow always looking a little hollow around the eyes. She walked in ahead of my son, Daniel, and for a split second, I saw her jaw tighten, like she was bracing for something only she could feel. Daniel waved at me first, his smile stretched too wide, as if rehearsed. "Mom, sorry we're late. Traffic on the bridge." I nodded, but my eyes stayed on Sienna. She barely muttered hello before sliding into her chair, her mother right behind her. I had met her mother only twice before. Marlene, a woman with stiff blonde curls, expensive perfume, and a sweetness so forced it made your teeth ache. That night, though, she wasn't pretending. She looked entertained in a way I couldn't yet name. We were meant to be celebrating Daniel's promotion, 33 years old, the first in our family to make senior analyst at Fairmont Industries. He had worked night shifts for years and now finally had something to be proud of. I planned the dinner. I made the reservation. I wanted it to be special. But from the moment they all sat down, something felt off. A tension at the table, thin but electric, like a wire stretched too far. The server came over with menus. "Is everyone ready for drinks?" Sienna didn't wait. "I'll have a Cabernet." She said it like a challenge. Daniel stiffened. The server hesitated. I could tell this wasn't about wine. Daniel spoke slowly, each word clipped. "We're having halibut. See, white makes more sense." Sienna didn't look at him. I said Cabernet. Her mother smirked. "My daughter knows what she wants." I tried to diffuse things. "It's just dinner. Order whatever you like." But Sienna's eyes shot to me for a fraction of a second. There was something pleading there, though covered instantly with defiance, as if she refused to let anyone see her break. Daniel leaned back, jaw tight, and the server hurried away. Silence fell over the table like a dropped curtain. My husband died 8 years ago, and dinners without him always felt quieter. But this silence was different. It was heavy and sharp-edged. I watched Daniel's fingers tapping the stem of his water glass, a nervous habit from childhood. He did it when he was overwhelmed, when fear and anger confused him. I hadn't seen that tapping since he was 50. I wanted to ask if everything was all right, but something in Sienna's posture kept me quiet. She sat too straight, shoulders locked, like someone sitting for a portrait while trying not to flinch. Our salads arrived. Marlene chatted about a neighbor's wedding, something about custom centerpieces and hand-painted invitations, but none of us responded. Daniel pushed lettuce around without eating. Sienna kept checking her phone under the table until Daniel finally whispered something between clenched teeth. She froze, then set the phone face down. I watched her hands. They trembled just enough for me to notice. The smell of halibut drifted from the kitchen. Soft piano music played overhead. A couple to our left laughed about something private. Everything looked normal around us, but I could feel something building, like the long inhale before a storm breaks. The entrees arrived. Daniel tried to make conversation, asking his wife about her day. She shrugged. "Nothing interesting. Same as always." He pressed again. "Did you call the office about the insurance forms?" She didn't look up. "I forgot." His voice lowered. "You didn't forget. We talked about it this morning." Marlene cut in, still smiling. "She has a lot on her mind. You expect too much." I felt Daniel's frustration rise like heat from pavement. He had always been patient, painfully patient. But that night his patience was a thin sheet of glass. Dinner dragged on. Every minute felt stretched. My chest tightened with each small exchange, each half smile, each time Sienna flared at nothing, then swallowed whatever she wanted to spit back. Then it happened. The server placed the wrong side dish in front of Daniel, a simple mistake, something that should never matter. But Sienna huffed loudly, shaking her head. Of course, even restaurants can't get anything right for him. The server apologized quickly. I'm so sorry, I can fix it. Daniel said it didn't matter, but Sienna wasn't done. He obsesses about the smallest things. Let him deal with it. Isn't that what he does best? Daniel's fork clattered against his plate. Stop. People turned. The server froze. And then, with no warning at all, Sienna reached out and slapped Daniel across the face. The sound cracked through the restaurant like a snapped branch. His head jerked to the side. A red print bloomed immediately on his cheek. I felt the air leave my lungs. Before anyone could react, Marlene leaned back in her chair and smiled. Good girl. Everything inside me turned cold. Daniel didn't move. He didn't shout. He didn't even raise his hand. He just stared at the table like he'd been hit by something far bigger than a slap. I stood so quickly my chair scraped the floor. The restaurant went silent except for the clink of someone dropping a fork across the room. Sienna finally looked at me. Not angry, not even ashamed, just waiting, as if she expected me to stay seated, as if she believed I would swallow it the way she had swallowed everything else I hadn't yet seen. My voice shook when I spoke. We're leaving. Now. Daniel blinked up at me, stunned. Mom, he whispered, please sit down. But I couldn't, because in that moment I understood something I should have seen months ago. My son wasn't just unhappy. He wasn't just stressed. He was trapped. And the women across the table had been helping tighten the trap. I reached for my purse with a trembling hand. The world around me blurred except for the three of them, sitting like a tableau I would never forget. And then, just as I stepped away from the table, I saw something else. A small detail. A bruise along Daniel's wrist just below the cuff of his shirt. Not the kind you get from bumping into a counter. The kind made by fingers. The room felt suddenly smaller. The ceiling lower. The lights too bright. I gripped the back of my chair to steady myself. This wasn't a single slap. This wasn't a bad night. This was a pattern. And it had been happening right under my nose. I looked at my son. His eyes were wet, unfocused, like he was somewhere far away. Daniel, come with me. He didn't move. Sienna's smile grew faint but firm, like a line drawn in sand. He's fine. Sit down. Margaret. Hearing my own name in her mouth made something inside me snap. I had been quiet for too long. I had convinced myself he was an adult who would tell me if something was wrong. But he hadn't, because shame builds walls, and abusers paint those walls with lies. I straightened, breath shaking, heart pounding. I didn't yet know what I would do. I didn't yet know how far this would go. I only knew one thing. I was not leaving my son at that table, and that was the moment everything began to unravel, though none of us knew just how far it would go. I opened my mouth to speak again, but before the words formed, the server returned hesitantly to the table, eyes wide, unsure whether to approach or retreat. And in that tiny pause, in that breath between what had already happened and what would happen next, the entire night balanced on the edge of something none of us could take back. The server hovered there, unsure, his hand gripping the edge of his tray as if it were a lifeline. I could feel every eye in the restaurant turning toward our table, waiting to see what would happen next. But the only thing I saw was my son. Daniel sat so still, he almost disappeared into himself. His shoulders rounded inward, his gaze fixed on the salt shaker, his breath shallow. I had seen children freeze like that during my years teaching elementary school, but never a grown man, certainly not my own son. I forced myself to breathe as I brushed past the server and stepped closer to Daniel. My hand hovered over his shoulder, afraid to touch him. afraid he might flinch. He finally raised his head. His eyes were red, rimmed with a kind of exhaustion I had never seen in him. Not physical exhaustion, something deeper, something learned. "Daniel, come outside with me for a moment. We need air." He opened his mouth as if to agree, but Sienna's hand clamped around his forearm before he could speak. The movement was small, almost polite, but her fingers tightened with quiet authority. He winced, just slightly, but I saw it. "He is not going anywhere." Her voice was soft, but each word landed like cold metal. "We are having dinner. Sit down, Margaret." The server took a step back. I took a step forward. Daniel stayed frozen in between us, caught like a deer on a dark highway. "Let go of him," I said, surprised at the steadiness in my voice. Marlene finally spoke, her tone sugary and sharp at the same time. "You are overreacting. Young couples have disagreements. Nothing happened. Sit down and stop making a public scene." A public scene. As if the slap never occurred. As if Sienna's own mother had not applauded it. I shook my head. "I am not sitting down." Sienna's eyes narrowed. She released Daniel's arm, but her expression warned him not to move. Then she stood, slowly, deliberately, and leaned across the table toward me until her face was inches from mine. She smelled of wine and vanilla and something sour underneath. "You are not taking him from here, not tonight, not ever." It was not a threat spoken loudly. It was something more dangerous. A promise whispered through clenched teeth. Daniel scrambled up between us before I could answer. "Stop it. Both of you just stop." He rubbed the side of his face where the red mark still showed. The movement was automatic, like he had done it many times before. I felt my stomach drop. The server cleared his throat and spoke to me in a nervous whisper. "Ma'am, would you like to step outside? Perhaps some water?" He seemed desperate to diffuse the moment. I nodded, more to give myself direction than anything else. I turned to Daniel. "Come outside, please." He hesitated, then looked at Sienna. Something passed between them, something too quick for me to read, but powerful enough to make him shrink. He whispered, "Let me talk to her first." That is not what I wanted to hear. Not after a slap, not after a bruise, not after her mother's smile. I stepped closer again. "You do not need her permission to breathe, Daniel." Sienna's lips curled into something that was not quite a smile. "He does not need yours either." Before I could respond, Daniel lifted both hands, pleading, "Mom, I will meet you outside in 1 minute, just one, please." The please sliced through me. He sounded like the boy who used to get nervous before school presentations, asking me to stay in the back of the room in case he forgot his lines. But he was a grown man now, and this was not stage fright. This was fear. I exhaled slowly, nodded once, and walked toward the entrance. The server trailed behind me, apologizing under his breath for things that were not his fault. I stepped out onto the sidewalk where the night air hit me like cold water. The street was quiet except for a car passing in the distance. My hands shook as I wrapped my coat tighter around myself. 1 minute turned into 2, then 3. When I reached for the door to go back inside, it swung open and Daniel stepped out. His eyes darted around nervously. He looked smaller somehow. "I am sorry, Mom," he said immediately. "I know that was awful. I know it looked bad." Looked bad. The phrase almost broke me. Looked bad, as if this were about appearances. I touched his arm gently. "Daniel, she hit you. In public. In front of your family." He winced again, then shook his head. "It is not what you think." That was the same thing Olivia had said in the story I once told another friend years ago. "It is not what you think." I felt the weight of those words all over again. I kept my voice calm. "Then tell me what I'm thinking." He rubbed his hands together, pacing in a small, agitated circle. "She has been stressed. Her job is unstable. Her mother lost her housing last year, and we had to help. Sienna is doing her best. I should not have brought up the insurance thing. I know how it sets her off. Sets her off. My throat tightened. Daniel, listen to yourself. He looked at me, really looked at me, and for a moment I saw a flicker of the truth he had been hiding, but the flicker was quickly smothered by something heavier. Shame. I asked quietly, how long has this been happening? He swallowed hard. Mom, please, not tonight. I do not want to ruin this dinner. This dinner. As if the slap had not already shattered it. I took another step toward him and lifted my hand toward his wrist. Let me see. He started to pull back, but then stopped. Slowly. He extended his arm. The bruise on his wrist was darker up close, a cluster of finger marks. Not old, not accidental. Daniel, this is abuse. He jerked his hand away as if burned. No, do not use that word. Do not make it sound like something it is not. I felt anger rise, not at him, but at the twisted logic that had been planted in him. Then what is it? He did not answer. He stared at the ground like a child caught doing something wrong. The restaurant door opened suddenly and Sienna appeared. Her expression had shifted. She looked almost calm now, controlled, composed. Marlene stood right behind her with folded arms. Sienna's voice was steady. Daniel, come back inside. We are leaving. We need to talk privately. She did not acknowledge me, not even with a glance. Daniel hesitated again, torn in two. I stepped between them. No, you are not leaving with him, not after this. Sienna tilted her head slightly, her jaw flexing. Did he ask for your permission? Because you are acting like he did? The sidewalk felt too narrow for the four of us. The air felt thin. I looked directly at my son. Daniel, if you walk away with them right now, I will not be able to help you. I am telling you this because I love you. Something dangerous is happening. You know it. I know it. Do not pretend you do not. His breath hitched. For a moment I saw panic in his eyes. But then Sienna touched his shoulder lightly, and he seemed to fold inward. He whispered, I have to go with her. Those words cracked something open inside me. I felt my fingertips go numb. Sienna turned, already guiding him toward the car parked a few spots down the street. Marlene followed, smirking at me as if she had won a contest I never agreed to enter. I called his name once more, Daniel. He paused, only for a heartbeat. He did not turn around. Then he got into the car and closed the door. The engine started. The taillights glowed red. The car backed out slowly, then pulled away from the curb and disappeared down the street. I stood there, gripping my coat, shaking in a way I had not shaken since the day I got the phone call that my husband had collapsed at work. The restaurant behind me hummed with life again. The world kept spinning. People laughed inside, clinking glasses and sharing desserts, unaware that my world had just shifted. I stayed on that sidewalk for several minutes before I finally forced myself to move. I walked to my own car, unlocked the door, and sat behind the wheel. The leather was cold, the silence deafening. I started the engine but did not drive. Instead, I stared at my hands, remembering the bruise on Daniel's wrist and the way he had recoiled when I said the word abuse. A single thought rose slowly through the chaos in my mind, clearer than anything else. If I did nothing, I would lose him, not to death, to someone living beside him. I put the car in drive, the headlights cutting through the darkness, and eased onto the empty street, knowing this night was only the beginning of something I was not prepared for, but could no longer ignore. I drove slowly through the quiet streets, my fingers tightening around the steering wheel every few blocks, as if my grip on the car could somehow steady the chaos spinning inside me. Porch lights glowed in scattered clusters along the neighborhood, soft and warm, like tiny promises that other homes were safe places. Mine had once been that, a place where Daniel could run in after school, where my husband's laughter filled the kitchen, where nothing felt poisoned. Tonight it felt foreign, like I was heading into a house that no longer belonged to the woman I used to be. When I finally parked in my driveway, the porch light flickered the way it sometimes did when the wiring acted up. I made a mental note to call an electrician, then stopped myself. The list of things that suddenly mattered felt overwhelming, and the list of things that no longer mattered felt even bigger. Inside, the house was silent, too silent. I hung my coat, set my keys on the entry table, and walked into the kitchen where the faint smell of the candles I had lit earlier still lingered. I had planned on celebrating Daniel. I had even baked a pie, hoping to surprise him after dinner. It sat cooling on the counter untouched. The sight of it made my throat tighten. I pulled out a chair and sat heavily, feeling the weight of what I had witnessed pressing on my chest. The slap, the bruise, the way Daniel avoided my eyes, the way he told me not to use the word abuse. Everything replayed in my mind like a film stuck on loop. I tried calling him once. The phone rang twice and then went to voicemail. I did not leave a message. My voice would have cracked. And I could not let him hear the fear in me. Not yet. Minutes passed, maybe hours. Time blurred while I sat there staring at nothing. At some point, the house creaked as the temperature dropped outside. I felt suddenly cold and got up to make tea, more for something to do than any real comfort. When the kettle began to hum, it startled me back into the moment. I poured the hot water, watching the steam rise like a thin veil between me and whatever came next. A vibration rattled the table, my phone, my heart jumped. I grabbed it. It was not Daniel. It was his father-in-law, Marlene's husband, a man I had met twice and hardly spoken to. My pulse kicked hard. There was no text, no missed call, just his name on the screen as an incoming call. I hesitated. I had no reason to speak with him, and I had no idea what he wanted. The call continued buzzing in my hand. I answered. His voice came out low, rough, almost as if he were whispering. "Margaret, are you alone?" I said yes. He exhaled shakily, the sound of a man bracing himself. "I figured you should know that Sienna and her mother showed up here already. They are furious." He paused, as if choosing his next words carefully. "Something is off with them. Has been for a while." I felt my skin prickle. "What do you mean?" He cleared his throat. "They keep Daniel cut off. Every time I ask to see him, they say he is busy. Something feels controlled, not normal marital issues, something darker." The kettle clicked again behind me, louder this time. I swallowed. She hit him tonight. There was silence on the other end, long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. Finally, he said softly, "I am not surprised. Margaret, watch your back. That family does not like interference. What do you think they want?" My voice trembled. "Control," he said simply. "They want control over your son, and they want it without you in the picture." The call ended as abruptly as it began. I set my phone down slowly. The house felt colder now, the shadows longer. If even the husband of that household sensed danger, then this was much bigger than I had understood. I stood for a long moment, gripping the back of the chair until my fingers hurt. I knew then that I would not sleep until I understood how far this had gone, how long my son had been hiding it, and what I had to do to protect him. I walked to the living room where the lamp cast a dim golden glow. I sat on the sofa, trying to gather my thoughts, when a memory nudged its way in, one that had not felt important until now. 3 months earlier, Daniel had stopped coming to our weekly Sunday dinners. He said he was working late, then said he was too tired, then said he would make it up to me next week. Each excuse felt polite but thin. At the time, I had believed him. Tonight, I saw the truth behind those missed dinners, clear and sharp as glass. There had been changes in him, too. His weight loss, his constant apologizing, his short temper mixed with long silences, the way he had once laughed easily and then suddenly did not laugh at all. And Sienna. Thinking back, there were signs with her as well. The way she answered for him, the way she dismissed him, the way she looked at me with irritation whenever I tried to ask him questions. I had chalked it up to personality differences, to the awkward adjustments newlyweds make. But tonight, those excuses felt naive. The front porch light flickered again. I got up and pulled the curtain back just slightly. A car drove by slowly, headlights sweeping across the front yard. I held my breath until it passed. My nerves were worn thin. I sat again and wrapped the blanket around my shoulders. The tea had gone cold, untouched. I finally lifted it for a sip and set it down with a sigh. I needed more information. I needed clarity. And I needed it before something worse happened. I reached for my laptop and opened it, the screen casting a cool glow on my face. I typed in topics I hoped I would never have to research. Psychological abuse, coercive control, subtle signs of partner violence, abuse of adult sons by female partners. The search results filled the screen, unsettling and comprehensive. I read article after article, each one confirming a truth I had tried to deny. Men can be victims too. Their silence can be deeper, their shame heavier, their suffering harder to see. I sat back in my chair and let out a slow, shaky breath. A new realization settled over me with chilling clarity. If I confronted Daniel too soon, if I pushed too hard, he might retreat further. If I provoked Sienna or Marlene, they might tighten whatever grip they already had on him. I needed patience, strategy, and evidence. As I closed the laptop, the house creaked again. This time I did not jump. I felt something inside me shift, a quiet but steady resolve rising like a tide. I had lost my husband suddenly, without warning. I would not lose my son in pieces, not to fear, not to shame, and certainly not to the hands of people who claimed to love him while destroying him inch by inch. I leaned back, forcing myself to breathe normally. Outside, the wind rustled the maple tree by the driveway. A car door slammed in the distance. A dog barked somewhere down the block. Life went on, but mine had changed. The night would be long, the days ahead even longer. I did not yet know what steps I would take, what lines would be crossed, or how far I would have to go. I only knew the moment had come when silence was no longer an option. I folded the blanket at my side and stood, turning off the lamp. The house slipped into darkness, except for the faint glow of the porch light through the window. I walked toward my bedroom slowly, knowing sleep would come late if it came at all. At the doorway, I paused, resting my hand on the frame as another thought rose quietly but firmly within me. Something had been set in motion tonight, something that none of us could stop now. And the more I pictured Daniel's bruised wrist, the more certain I became that the truth, whatever it was, would not stay hidden much longer. I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling long after the house had gone silent. Sleep never came. My thoughts circled the same place again and again, each lap heavier than the last. The bruise on Daniel's wrist, the slap, the look in his eyes, the way Sienna had spoken to me like I was an obstacle she intended to remove. At some point, the sky began to lighten, a gray dawn creeping over the tops of the maple trees outside my window. I pushed back the covers, knowing I would not find rest by trying. Downstairs, the kitchen felt colder than usual. I made coffee and held the mug between my palms while I thought about what I needed to do. Daniel would be getting ready for work soon. If he even went, I had no way of knowing. And I knew showing up at their house would only make Sienna tighten her grip on him. I needed another way in, someone who could confirm what I suspected or point me toward what I could not yet see. As I stood at the sink watching the pale morning light touch the yard, a name came to me, Nina, their babysitter, a quiet girl in her early 20s who had always seemed gentle with little Jack. The few times I had seen her, she looked tired in a way young people should not look, and she had stopped appearing in their photos months ago. I had not thought anything of it then. Now it meant something different. I went to my phone and found a number Daniel had texted me last year when I had offered to pick up Jack from school one day, Nina's number. I dialed before I could talk myself out of it. She answered on the third ring. Her voice was soft and startled. "Hello." "Nina, this is Margaret Hill. I hope I am not calling too early." There was a pause long enough that I wondered if she would hang up. Then she exhaled, a shaky sound, and said she remembered me. I hesitated only a moment. "Nina, I need to ask you something. It is about Daniel and Sienna, about last night. Is everything all right with them?" Silence filled the line, that heavy kind that carries meaning without words. When she finally spoke, her voice cracked. "Mrs. Hill, I cannot be involved. Please, I really cannot." My heart pounded. "Nina, I am worried. I think something dangerous is happening." Another pause. A car passed outside my window, the sound of tires on damp pavement. Nina whispered, "You are not wrong, but if I say anything, they will come after me. They already threatened to sue when I tried to quit." My stomach tightened. "Why would they threaten you for quitting?" "Because I saw things." Her voice was barely audible. Things I should not have seen. Things I did not know how to explain without sounding dramatic, but it was real. All of it. She stopped again, breathing unevenly. I waited. Finally she said, "I saw her hurt him, more than once." My hand shook as I gripped the countertop. "What did you see?" Nina spoke in short bursts, as if afraid someone might overhear. One time, Sienna shoved him against the hallway wall so hard a picture frame fell. He told me not to worry about it, said it was a misunderstanding. Another time, she grabbed his shirt so tight it tore, and she blames him for everything, every spilled drink, every tantrum, every bill, every problem. He apologizes constantly. It is like watching someone vanish piece by piece. I closed my eyes. The ache in my chest spread downward as if rooting itself. Nina continued. And the worst part was that she made their son watch. She called it teaching moments. She wanted him to see who was in charge. I opened my eyes again and felt them sting. "Why did you quit?" Nina hesitated, as if weighing what she could reveal. She said softly, "Because she slapped him in front of the child. Hard. Harder than what happened last night." And she looked at me as if daring me to protest. She wanted me to see it. It was not a mistake. It was a message. My breath caught. A cold anger spread slowly through me, an anger I had not felt in years. I asked Nina if she had any proof, anything at all. For a moment I thought she would refuse. Then she said she had kept a video, a short one. She did not know why she had saved it. Maybe because she needed someone else to know she had not imagined it. "I can send it," she whispered, "but you have to promise you will not tell them it came from me." I promised. My voice was steady, but I felt far from steady. A moment later, my phone buzzed with a message. I opened it, and there on my screen was Daniel standing in his living room, shoulders slumped, saying something I could not quite hear. Sienna appeared from the right, her face twisted with contempt, and shoved him backward. He fell into the coffee table. The sound of the impact made me flinch, even though it was only a recording. Little Jack stood nearby crying. My stomach lurched. I could not breathe for several seconds. Nina whispered, "It is worse when her mother is around. She encourages it, says men need to be put in their place. I have heard her say it." I thanked her, told her she had helped more than she knew, and promised again to keep her identity private. When the call ended, I set the phone down and pressed my hands to my face, trying to steady myself. The truth was bigger than I imagined, and far uglier. I walked into the living room, suddenly needing to feel movement in my legs. I stood near the window and watched the sunlight spread across the lawn, slowly warming the frost from the night before. I used to think morning light made things clearer. Today, it made the truth impossible to ignore. My son was living in a house where violence was not a rare outburst, but a pattern, a routine, a lesson being taught to a child too young to understand it and too helpless to escape it. And Sienna was not alone. She had grown up with this behavior. She had a mother who supported it and a family who saw dominance as strength. I thought back to what Marlene's husband had said. They want control. They want him without you in the picture. A shiver ran through me. There was a reason they wanted Daniel isolated. Abusers do not want witnesses. They do not want influences that shift the balance. I returned to the kitchen and stared at the cold coffee. I felt a pull deep inside me, something fierce and maternal that had been dormant since Daniel was small. I could not barge into their home, but I could not sit here waiting either. I needed guidance, someone who understood the laws, the risks, the steps, someone who could tell me what I needed to do before things escalated further. I picked up my phone again and scrolled to a number I'd saved years ago when a former student's mother had gone through a violent marriage, a family law attorney named Michael Grayson. I remembered his calm voice at a school meeting, the way he had explained things simply without frightening anyone more than necessary. I dialed. He answered quickly, Grayson speaking. This is Margaret Hill. I know it has been years, but I need help. It is my son. His tone shifted instantly. Tell me what is going on. I told him enough for him to understand the urgency, but not enough for the whole story. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he asked if I could come to his office that afternoon. He wanted to see the video. He wanted to hear every detail. As I hung up, I felt a faint shift inside me. Not relief. Relief was too far away. It was something smaller, but important. Direction. I stood in the middle of my quiet kitchen, surrounded by the life I had built, the routines I still maintained, the memories that still lived inside these walls. Everything felt steady except me. I had never imagined I would need to protect my grown son from his own wife. I had never imagined a future where violence crept into his home, the way mold creeps into the corners of an old house, silent but destructive. I looked at the clock. The morning had slipped away. I gathered my bag, my coat, the printed reservation confirmation from the night before still in my purse, as if proof of the moment things changed. Before leaving, I walked through the house, turning off lights and checking locks, habits formed after my husband died. At the front door, I paused, hand on the doorknob, feeling the weight of what was ahead. I stepped outside into the cold afternoon air as a faint wind rustled the leaves along the sidewalk. A neighbor waved from across the street. I waved back without thinking. Everything looked normal, but nothing was normal anymore. I locked the door behind me and started toward my car, knowing that whatever happened in the hours ahead would shape everything that came next. The drive to Michael Grayson's office took longer than usual, or at least it felt that way. Traffic through downtown Stamford crawled past storefronts already decorated for late autumn, their windows filled with pumpkins and artificial leaves. People walked along the sidewalks carrying coffee or chatting in small groups. The pleasant rhythm of ordinary life surrounding me, like a world I had somehow stepped out of. My own pulse was too fast, my mind too full, my stomach too tight. I barely noticed the changing lights or the turns I took. I only knew I had to get there. When I pulled into the parking lot outside the modest brick building where Michael practiced, I sat still for a moment with the engine running. I watched a man walking a small dog along the sidewalk, watched a woman juggling a toddler on her hip as she dug through her purse for her keys. Their lives felt untouched by the kind of darkness that had crept into mine. A strange envy flickered through me, gentle but sharp. I turned off the car and reached for my bag. Inside, the lobby was quiet, soft lighting, neutral carpet. A woman at the front desk looked up from her computer and smiled the way people do when they recognize a name, even if they cannot place the face. "You must be Mrs. Hill. Mr. Grayson is expecting you. You can go right in." My feet felt heavier with each step down the short hallway. When I entered his office, he stood from behind his desk and greeted me warmly, offering a firm handshake and a steady look that reminded me why I had remembered him all these years. He had the kind of presence that made you feel listened to before you even spoke. "Please sit," he said, and I lowered myself into a leather chair that squeaked slightly under my weight. He settled back into his seat, folded his hands, and nodded. "Tell me what you have, Margaret." I opened my bag, removed my phone, and set it between us on the desk. My hand shook as I unlocked it. I pulled up the video Nina had sent and pressed play. Michael leaned forward slightly but kept his expression neutral as Daniel appeared on the screen, as Sienna stormed into frame, as the shove sent him crashing into the table. He watched the whole thing once without comment. When it ended, he exhaled through his nose and sat back. "That is hard to see. I am sorry." I swallowed. "That is my son. That is my grandson watching." He nodded slowly. "Margaret, this is not a marital spat. This is domestic violence. And it is severe enough that if we present this, it will be taken seriously in any court in this state." I stared at the phone on his desk, the frozen image of Daniel still visible. My chest tightened. "What do I do? How do I get him away from her?" "You do not go to the house. Not yet. You do not confront her. You do not confront her mother. You gather information, evidence, statements. You let a professional intervene when the time is right." I pressed my hands together to stop them from trembling. "I do not know if he will talk to me. He would not last night. He is ashamed." "Shame is common," Michael said gently. "Men rarely want to admit they are being abused. They often believe it reflects on their strength or character. But physical evidence speaks. Video speaks. A pattern speaks. And Margaret, from what you have told me, there is clearly a pattern." I nodded stiffly, waiting for him to continue. "I will advise you on next steps. First, you protect yourself. Do not let them know you are seeking help. People like Sienna or her mother will escalate if they feel threatened. Second, we need more documentation. If you can, ask Daniel to see a doctor for that wrist. Even a simple medical note could matter. Third, we plan for intervention in a way that minimizes risk for him and the child." I blinked. "Daniel will not go to a doctor unless she lets him. She controls everything." Michael hesitated. "This will be difficult, but sometimes family members can create opportunities, a reason for him to leave the house, even briefly. If we can get him alone, even for 20 minutes, I can speak with him myself. I can explain the legal protections available." It felt like trying to build a bridge across a river in the middle of a storm. I rubbed my forehead, as if sensing the weight pressing down on me. Michael softened his voice. "You are not alone in this. You reached out. That was the right first step. Many people never make it that far." I nodded, though my throat felt too tight for words. He leaned back, thoughtful. "You said there is a child involved, a boy, 6 or 7. "Yes, Jack." "Then we have more urgency than even the video suggests. Courts treat exposure to domestic violence seriously, very seriously. His safety matters as much as his father's. My hand drifted toward the phone again, my thumb brushing the screen. He is such a sweet child, always quiet, always watching. Children in those homes learn to read danger early. Their silence is a survival skill. A lump rose in my throat. I pushed it down. Michael looked at me carefully. I want you to be prepared. This will not be quick. It will not be simple, but it is possible. And you contacted me soon enough that real damage can still be prevented. Real damage. The words lingered. He stood slowly, signaling the end of the meeting, and handed me a card with his direct number. Call me if anything changes. Call if he reaches out. Call if you get more evidence or if anything feels urgent. I placed the card carefully in my purse and stood. Thank you. I do not think you know how much I appreciate this. I walked out of the office with my bag clutched to my side. The receptionist gave me another gentle smile as I passed. Outside, the crisp air startled my lungs back into motion. I walked to my car as if my legs were on autopilot. I sat behind the wheel for a moment, letting the quiet settle around me. A gust of wind blew leaves across the parking lot. I watched them scatter. Everything felt so fragile yet moving. On my drive home, I took a different route, one that passed a park where Daniel used to play as a boy. For a moment, I pulled over and parked along the curb. The playground was empty except for a man walking his dog and a pair of teenagers sharing a bench. I watched them without really seeing their faces. I was seeing Daniel at 6 years old, racing down the slide, laughing so loudly that other parents would smile. He used to wave at me every time he hit the ground. Look, Mom, look at me. Now he was the one falling, and no one had been watching until now. I drove home slowly, as if rushing would somehow break the thread of resolve I was holding on to. When I reached my house, I parked in the driveway but did not get out right away. I checked my phone again out of habit. Still nothing from Daniel. No call, no text, nothing to shield him with, nothing to guide me, just silence. I finally stepped outside, grateful for the cold air brushing against my flushed cheeks. My shoes crunched on the gravel as I walked toward the front door. I had just reached the porch when another car turned into my driveway. My breath caught. A silver sedan rolled to a stop behind mine. I recognized it even before the driver stepped out. It was Daniel. He looked pale, worn out, the kind of tired that goes far beyond lack of sleep. He lifted a hand in a half wave, timid, almost guilty. Mom, he said quietly, can we talk? I stood still, the air around me suddenly thinner. My heart pounded like it wanted out of my chest. I stepped back and held the door open for him, unsure whether to feel relief or dread. He walked past me into the house with slow, uncertain steps, as if crossing a line he could not unstep. I closed the door behind us and turned to face him, bracing myself for whatever truth or denial might come next. Daniel stood in my living room, like someone unsure of the ground beneath him. He looked around as if the walls themselves might judge him, then lowered himself slowly onto the edge of the couch. I sat in the armchair across from him, hands folded tightly in my lap. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The quiet between us felt different from the quiet in the restaurant. Softer, sadder, but still heavy. Daniel finally ran a hand through his hair and let out a breath that sounded more like surrender than relief. Mom, I should not have shown up like this. I just needed to breathe. I needed space. You're always welcome here. My voice came out steadier than I expected. Tell me what happened today. He looked down at his hands. The skin along his wrist was still discolored, a fading imprint of fingers. I tried not to stare at it. He rubbed that spot absent-mindedly, the way someone touches a scar without realizing it. It is not what you think, Mom. Sienna and I just had an argument last night. She had a lot to drink. We both said things we regret. I leaned slightly forward. She slapped you. That is not an argument. That is violence. He flinched. I should not have pushed her. I brought up those insurance forms, and she was already stressed. Her boss has been writing her for weeks, and Jack has been waking up in the middle of the night. No one is sleeping. People do things when they are tired. I kept my voice calm but firm. Daniel, tired people do not leave bruises. He closed his eyes as if my words were too bright. When he opened them again, they were wet. I know how it looks, but I do not want anyone thinking she is some kind of monster. She had a hard childhood. She is trying her best. It hit me how deeply he believed this, how much he needed to believe it. That belief was part of the cage Sienna kept him in. I asked gently, "Who told you her best includes hurting you?" He did not answer. He sat back, shoulders sagging, defeat creeping into him like a slow tide. His silence told me more than any explanation could. I stood and walked to the kitchen, not to escape, but to give him a moment. I poured 2 glasses of water, brought them back, and handed him one. He held it without drinking. "I saw something today," I said quietly as I sat down again. "Something that tells me what happened last night was not the first time." Daniel stiffened. "What did you see?" Before I could decide how to answer, he seemed to fold inward, like someone bracing for impact. "Please do not tell me someone recorded us." His voice cracked. "That is private." I paused, choosing each word with care. "Someone saw you falling into the table. Jack was crying. They were worried. I was worried." He stared at me as if the air had been knocked out of him. His face changed. Shame, fear, panic, all fighting for space. "Who sent it to you?" "She trusted me. I will not involve her." I kept my voice steady. "The question now is not who saw it. The question is how long this has been happening." He pressed his hands over his face. "Mom, please stop." "No." I kept my tone gentle. "This is the moment I cannot stop." He lowered his hands and looked at me, eyes glassy. "You do not understand. She apologizes afterward, every time. She says she is trying to be better. She says I make her feel out of control. She grew up around yelling and she hates it. She tells me she is scared of becoming like her mother." "Are you scared of becoming invisible?" I asked softly. His jaw trembled. That hit something in him, a truth he had been avoiding but could not defend against. I stood slowly and moved to the couch, sitting beside him. I did not touch him. I wanted to, but I waited. "Daniel, when did this start?" It took him a long time to answer. His voice came out as a whisper. "After Jack was born. At first it was small things. She said I held him wrong. She said I made her feel stupid when I offered to help. Then she said I embarrassed her when I asked her mother not to come over so loudly. She said I was too emotional, too soft, not a real partner." I could hear the words as he said them. Words can bruise long before hands do. And then I thought if I could just do better, she would stop. He looked down at his wrist again, but it kept getting worse. I finally placed my hand over his. Warm, light, solid. "You do not deserve this. Neither does Jack." His voice broke on that name. He turned away again, elbows on his knees, head bowed. I could see the conflict in him, like he was torn between defending her and begging for escape. "She needs me," he whispered. "She says without me she would fall apart." "And you believe that?" I asked gently. He squeezed his eyes shut. "Yes, sometimes. And sometimes I think she would be fine without me. But her mother keeps saying she is lucky to have a husband who stays even when she acts out. They say men used to be stronger. They say I should not take things so personally." My stomach twisted. Marlene's voice echoed through every sentence he repeated. "Daniel," I said carefully, "people who love you do not train you to feel grateful for mistreatment." He shook his head quickly, almost violently. "Mom, do not make this worse. If she finds out I came here, she will think I am turning you against her. I inhaled slowly, willing myself not to push too hard. All right, then listen. I met with someone today, an attorney who specializes in situations like this. He wants to help you. He said there are steps to protect you and Jack. He said this is serious. Daniel stared at me, stunned. You talked to a lawyer, Mom. Why would you do that? Because I saw what she is doing to you. Because you are my son. Because I lost your father too fast, and I refused to lose you slowly. He stood abruptly and moved toward the window, pacing as if trying to outrun my words. He pressed his palms to the glass and lowered his head. I cannot deal with this right now. If she thinks I'm talking to lawyers, she will lose it. You do not know what she is capable of. Then tell me, I said softly, what is she capable of? He turned to face me, and the fear in his eyes was unmistakable. She threatened to take Jack and disappear once, said her family had connections, said I would never see him again if I pushed her too hard. I thought she was bluffing, but now I do not know. A chill ran down my spine. He put both hands on the back of the armchair, gripping it until his knuckles whitened. I need time. I need to think. I cannot blow up my entire life in one day. I walked to him slowly and placed a hand on his arm. He did not pull away. That small victory felt monumental. You do not have to decide everything today. Just let someone help you. Let someone else hold the weight for a moment. His shoulders slumped. He nodded once, but it was the kind of nod that meant nothing was actually resolved. He was agreeing to end the conversation, not to change his life. He moved toward the door. I should go before she starts asking where I am. Daniel, wait. He turned back, tired, hurting, but still my boy. Promise me one thing. If she hurts you again, or if you ever feel unsafe, you will come here. You will come to me. He exhaled slowly. I promise. He opened the door and stepped onto the porch. For a moment, he stood there staring at the street, as if unsure which direction to go. Then he walked to his car, got in, and started the engine. I watched him pull away, a knot forming in my chest, tightening with each second until his car disappeared down the block. I closed the door gently and leaned my back against it, letting the silence of the house press around me. The promise he gave me whispered through my mind. It was something, not enough, but something. I pushed away from the door and walked to the kitchen, the afternoon light stretching across the floor in long, pale bands. I filled a glass of water, took a sip, and set it down. Something was coming. I could feel it, like the tremor before an earthquake. And whatever it was, I knew we were running out of time. I walked through the house, turning off lights one by one, but the quiet did nothing to settle me. A low unease threaded through every room, a feeling that the walls themselves were waiting for something to happen. I moved to the window and pulled the curtain aside, scanning the street the way people do when they are listening for a sound they have not yet heard. Nothing. No cars. No footsteps. Just the faint hum of a distant leaf blower somewhere in the neighborhood and the low rustle of branches shifting in the afternoon wind. I tried to distract myself by straightening the living room, folding the throw blanket over the back of the couch, stacking the magazines on the coffee table, little tasks that once made me feel grounded. Today they felt pointless. Every few minutes I checked my phone. Nothing from Daniel. Nothing at all. Each empty notification screen felt like a small blow. By early evening, the sky had turned a deep shade of blue. That moment right before the streetlights click on. I was standing at the sink, rinsing a mug, when loud knocks pounded suddenly against my front door. Not tentative, not polite, sharp and fast. My heart jolted in my chest. I dried my hands quickly and moved toward the hallway, every instinct alert. When I opened the door, Officer Jenna Ruiz stood on my porch in her Navy uniform, her expression tense, her breath visible in the cooling air. "Mrs. Hill," she said, "we need to talk." My throat tightened. "Is it Daniel? Is he all right?" She stepped inside when I motioned her in. The way she shut the door behind her told me this was not going to be a brief conversation. She stood in the entryway, hands resting on her duty belt in that calm but ready stance I had seen in officers before. "He is physically all right," she said, "but there was an incident at his house an hour ago. A neighbor called in a disturbance, yelling, crashing sounds. We responded. My knees weakened, and I reached for the edge of the console table. What happened? When we arrived, Sienna answered the door. She said everything was fine, but she refused to let us speak privately with Daniel. That raised concerns. A child was also present and crying. My pulse hammered unevenly. Where is my grandson now? He is still with them. We did not have legal grounds to remove him, but that may change depending on what is documented. Officer Ruiz glanced at me, reading the panic on my face. She softened her voice. I know this is difficult, but I have handled enough of these situations to recognize signs of coercive control. Something is going on in that house. Yes, I whispered, something is... She nodded slowly. We spoke briefly to Daniel at the door. He was subdued, guarded. He would not say much, and his wife kept interrupting. He also had an older bruise on his wrist. That concerned us. I felt my breath catch. He told them nothing. He was still protecting her. Officer Ruiz's voice lowered. Mrs. Hill, we cannot force him to talk, but we can keep a record. And the more documentation we have, the better chance we have to intervene if things escalate. I swallowed the ache rising in my chest. I met with an attorney today. I have video, proof of physical abuse. She shoved him in front of their child. Would that help you? Her eyes sharpened with interest. Yes, that would be important, especially if the child witnessed it. If you can provide that, it strengthens any future investigation. I nodded quickly. I will send it. She looked around my living room, noticing the tidiness, the pictures on the mantel, the framed photo of Daniel at his college graduation. Then her gaze returned to me with a touch of something softer, maybe empathy. I want to ask you something, she said gently. Has he ever asked for help, even indirectly? He came here today, I said quietly. He seemed terrified to speak the truth. He told me she threatened to take Jack and disappear. Officer Ruiz inhaled sharply, as if confirming a suspicion. That is not uncommon in cases like this. Threats involving children often trap victims even more tightly. She paused. Did he say whether he felt unsafe going back there tonight? He said he had to go, that she would lose it if he stayed too long. Ruiz nodded with a grim understanding. We are keeping his address flagged for call priority. And for what it is worth, you did the right thing involving legal counsel. This is a delicate situation, but it is not hopeless. I stood there absorbing her words, each one a mixture of reassurance and dread. She continued, if anything changes, if he reaches out, if the child is in immediate danger, you call us. Do not hesitate. I promised her I would. She stepped back toward the door, and just before opening it, she turned to me again. One more thing. Mrs. Hill, people in abusive households often have their phone activity monitored. If he stops communicating, it may not mean he does not want to. Be mindful. Look for moments when he can talk safely. Her words sank into me like stones dropped into deep water. She left with a nod, and I closed the door slowly, feeling the house echo with the silence she left behind. I walked back into the living room and sank into the armchair, pressing the heels of my hands against my eyes. Everything was unraveling faster than I expected. I needed to think. I needed to act. But every choice felt like stepping through a minefield. My phone buzzed on the coffee table. I jerked my head up, pulse racing. I reached for it quickly. It was a message from a number I did not recognize. A short text, 2 words. Help me. My hands trembled as I stared at the screen. Then another message arrived, this one longer, typed quickly enough that there were small errors. Can't talk long. Need out. She locked my phone earlier, borrowing hers while she is in shower. Don't reply. My breath hitched. My vision blurred with fear and relief tangled together. A third message came. She told her mother she will fix things tonight. I don't know what that means. I'm scared for me and for Jack. I pressed a hand to my mouth, muffling the sound rising in my throat. He was asking for help. The moment Michael said might come, the moment the officer warned me to watch for, and it was happening now. Then his final message appeared. If I do not text again, something happened. The phone went silent. I sat rigid, every instinct screaming at me to get in the car, to drive to him, to break down the door if I had to. But Michael's warnings came back like a cold wind. Do not confront. Do not escalate. Do not give them reason to tighten the cage. I stood abruptly, unable to stay still. I paced the length of the living room, my breath shallow and fast. I checked the time. Late enough that the streets would be empty, too late to do nothing, too dangerous to rush in. I grabbed my phone with shaking hands and dialed Officer Ruiz's number. My voice cracked as soon as she answered. It is Daniel. He just sent a message. He is scared. I read his words aloud, my throat tightening around each one. She listened without interrupting, then said firmly, We are sending a unit. Do not go to the house. Stay by your phone. Stay inside. I agreed, but my body felt pulled toward the door as if a string were tied around my wrist and stretched all the way to Daniel's living room. I forced myself to sit on the couch and clasp my hands together to keep from moving. Minutes passed like hours. My heart hammered so hard that it hurt. I stared at my silent phone, waiting for something, anything to break the stillness. A soft tapping sounded against the window, a branch brushing in the wind, but to me it sounded like warning. Somewhere in that house across town, my son was facing something I could not see, and all I could do was wait. I sat stiffly on the couch, my hands pressed together so tightly my knuckles ached. The house felt too quiet, as if it too were holding its breath. I could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator, the distant tick of the hallway clock, but everything inside me was tuned only to one thing, my phone. Every second that passed without a vibration scraped against my nerves. I kept glancing at the screen, willing it to light up, to show me some sign that Daniel was safe. Nothing came. Outside, the street grew darker. The porch light cast a pale cone across the front steps, catching the swirl of leaves blowing in the wind. I kept imagining headlights appearing at the end of the block, a squad car turning into view, something to tell me that help had reached him. Still nothing. I stood suddenly and paced from the couch to the doorway and back again. My mind kept replaying his final message, every word repeating like a warning. If I do not text again, something happened. I pressed my hands against my eyes, trying to stop the tremble in my chest. When my phone finally buzzed, I lunged for it. It was Officer Ruiz. We are heading it. Stay put. I will update you as soon as we can. Her voice was steady but clipped, the way people sound when they are moving toward danger. Before I could reply, she ended the call. My knees weakened, and I sank back into the couch, gripping the armrest as a wave of dizziness swept over me. I tried to breathe slowly, but each inhale felt shallow, thin. 10 minutes passed, maybe 15. Time felt warped, stretched too far in every direction. Then another vibration cut through the silence. I grabbed the phone so quickly I nearly dropped it. A text from Ruiz. We are on scene, attempting entry. I clutched the phone to my chest. My imagination filled the silence with everything I hoped was not happening. Raised voices, doors slamming, a child crying, Daniel pleading. I could almost see the house. every room holding a threat I could not name. Another message came. Still trying to make contact. Stand by. I stood and moved to the window, pressing my hand against the cold glass. The street was still empty. Not even a passing car. Just the soft flicker of my porch light and the restless wind moving through the branches. It felt like an eternity before my phone rang again. I answered immediately. Mrs. Hill, this is Ruiz. We made entry. Her voice was lower now, more serious. My heart pounded wildly. He is alive. That was the first thing she said, and I nearly collapsed with relief. There was more weight in her voice, though, and the relief froze in my throat. She continued, he is shaken, disoriented, no severe injuries that we can see, but he is in shock. The child is safe as well. We have him separated. I gripped the edge of the windowsill, unable to speak for a moment. What happened? We are sorting that out now. We heard yelling when we arrived. There was a loud crash inside. When we got in, he was on the floor, and she was standing over him. He claims he fell. Ruiz paused. I did not believe him. A tremor went through my whole body. Is he coming here? He wants to. We advised him to leave the house for the night. We are speaking with him on whether he wants medical evaluation or to file a report. You should prepare for him to need a calm environment. Yes, of course, anything. We are also bringing the child to a relative for now. Sienna was not cooperative. She and her mother are being questioned separately. My breath caught. Questioned. That meant things escalated even further than I imagined. Then Ruiz said something more quietly. He asked for you. I closed my eyes, letting that truth settle over me like a blanket I had waited years to pull around myself. We will escort him to your home once we finish processing the scene. Keep your phone nearby. I thanked her, though the words felt small compared to what I felt inside. When the call ended, I lowered myself onto the couch, this time without pacing. My legs felt too unsteady to hold me. An hour passed, maybe longer. I kept the porch light on and the living room lamps glowing, wanting Daniel to see warmth when he arrived, wanting him to know he was stepping into safety. I had just set a kettle of water on the stove when headlights swept across the front yard. A police cruiser rolled to a stop by the curb. My breath caught as the passenger door opened and Daniel stepped out. He looked older than he had that morning. His face was pale, his eyes swollen, his movements slow and unsteady. An officer walked beside him, not touching him, but close enough that Daniel would not have to enter the house alone. I moved to the door and opened it before they reached the steps. Daniel looked up at me, and something in his expression broke whatever was left of my composure. He stepped inside, and the officer nodded respectfully before returning to the car. When the door closed behind us, Daniel stood in the center of the living room, arms wrapped tightly around himself, as if trying to hold all the pieces together. I approached him slowly. Are you hurt? He shook his head, though his eyes said something different. I am not sure. Everything happened so fast. I guided him to the couch, the same one where he had sat hours earlier, a different man. He lowered himself gently, elbows on his knees, hands clasped together. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The house seemed to mute itself around him. He finally whispered. She threw a glass. It shattered behind me. I slipped. That is what I told them. But it is not the truth. She was angry about the police showing up. She blamed me, said I embarrassed her, said I made her look unstable. He rubbed his forehead. Jack started crying. Her mother yelled at him for it. Everything spiraled. My heart twisted painfully. Where is Jack now? With one of her cousins. The officer said it was temporary. He lifted his head slowly and looked at me, and the fear in his eyes was raw. Mom, I think she's losing control, and I do not know what she will do next. I reached for his hand and held it firmly. Daniel, you are not going back there tonight. Not tomorrow. Not until we figure out something that keeps you and Jack safe. He closed his eyes as if bracing against a wave. His voice trembled. I do not know how to leave her. I do not know how to do this. She said she would take him. She said I would never see him again. I squeezed his hand tighter. You are not alone. I am right here. We will do this one step at a time. His breath shook and he leaned forward, resting his forehead against my shoulder. His whole body trembled. Not from cold, but from everything he had kept inside for too long. I wrapped my arms around him and held him close, the way I had when he was small and the world had frightened him. We stayed like that for a long time. Eventually, he pulled back, wiping his eyes with the heel of his hand. He tried to steady himself, but there was something hollow in his expression that made my heart ache. He whispered, "What if she comes here?" I looked toward the door, then back at him. If she comes, she will not get near you, and she will not get near the child. I promise you that. He nodded, though I could see the fear still clinging to him like a shadow. I stood. You need rest. You can take the guest room. I will stay up in case the officer calls again. He hesitated, then rose slowly from the couch and followed me down the hallway. At the doorway of the guest room, he turned back to me. Mom, thank you. I brushed his arm gently. Go lie down. You are safe here. He stepped inside and closed the door softly. I waited until the sound settled into the quiet of the house before I returned to the living room. I lowered myself into the armchair and stared at the faint reflection of the porch light in the window. The night had not ended, not by a long stretch. Somewhere in that house across town, Sienna and Marlene were spinning their own version of events. Somewhere, lines were being drawn more sharply than before, and whatever came next would not stay contained for long. I stayed in that armchair until the sky outside began to turn pale. The quiet inside the house felt heavy, like the kind that sits on your shoulders and makes every breath deeper than it needs to be. I kept listening for movement from the guest room, half expecting Daniel to come out shaken from another nightmare, half hoping he was finally getting the kind of sleep he had not had in months. When my phone rang at 6:15, I jumped. The sound felt too sharp against the stillness. I answered before the second ring. It was Officer Ruiz again. Her voice was steady, but there was something different in her tone that pulled me upright. Mrs. Hill, you should know we received another call regarding the home. My chest tightened. What now? Ruiz exhaled quietly. Shortly after we escorted your son out, Marlene left the property. She was extremely agitated. Neighbors reported hearing shouting from inside before she drove off. We have reason to believe she attempted to confront the relative who has temporary custody of the child. My spine went cold. Did she get to him? No. Thankfully, the relative did not open the door, but it was a scene. She caused property damage, screaming, banging. She accused your son of conspiring against her daughter. We intervened before it escalated further. I pressed a hand to my forehead. Is Jack safe now? He is still with the same family member, but we will likely move him to a secured supervised care arrangement until the court makes a ruling. This situation is escalating faster than expected. I closed my eyes for a moment. Every instinct in me screamed to go get that boy and hold him until all the tremors in his world stopped shaking. But this was not a fight I could win by impulse. It needed to be by law, by record, by careful documented truth. Ruiz continued, we are preparing a petition for emergency protective custody. You and your son need to be ready to discuss next steps with CPS later today. I glanced down the hallway to where Daniel slept. He needs a few hours. He was barely standing last night. Let him rest as much as he can, Ruiz said gently. But do not let him leave the house. And do not talk with either woman if they reach out. After the call ended, I stared at the phone in my hand, feeling a deep ache across my chest. The circle of danger was expanding, pulling more people into its gravity. The only comfort was that now it was documented, witnessed, recorded. A system that had seemed slow only a day ago was suddenly paying attention. Around 7:30, I heard soft footsteps in the hallway. Daniel emerged, hair rumpled, eyes tired but clearer than the night before. He had wrapped a blanket around his shoulders. "Morning," he murmured, voice rough. "Did you sleep at all?" I shook my head. "Not really. How are you feeling?" He sat slowly at the dining table, rubbing the back of his neck, like I spent the night tumbling down a staircase. My head still feels foggy. I poured him coffee and set the mug in front of him. He curled his hands around it, letting the heat sink into his fingers. He looked smaller somehow, like the night had pulled something out of him he could not put back. "There is something you need to know," I said, taking the chair across from him. "It is about his mother." He lifted his gaze, a faint dread flickering in his eyes. "What about her?" I explained the events of the early morning, how she tried to force her way into the relative's home, how she screamed, how police intervened. Daniel leaned back, his shoulders sagging. "God, this is going to explode." "It already has," I said quietly. "We are seeing who she becomes when she feels control slipping, and the court will see it too." He stared into the mug, jaw tightening. Part of me feels guilty, like I triggered something I cannot undo, like maybe I should have handled things differently. "Daniel, listen to me. That woman was spiraling long before last night. You did not create that storm. You only finally got out of its center." He swallowed hard. His voice fell to a whisper. "I'm scared for Jack." "I know, but this gives us leverage. The court cannot ignore this kind of escalation." He nodded slowly, absorbing it, then looked toward the living room window. The morning light was getting brighter, washing the street in a pale gold glow. After a long silence, he said, "Mom, I need to talk about yesterday, about what happened before the police came." I waited, letting him find the words. He kept his eyes on the window. She was furious when she thought I was recording her. I was not. I had not touched my phone, but she was convinced I was building a case against her. She said I was turning into you. My stomach tightened. Turning into me. She meant it as an insult. She said I let you poison my mind, that you always hated her. She kept pacing the living room, yelling, saying I was trying to destroy her life. I watched him closely. He was speaking like someone still stepping carefully through the memory. Then she grabbed my arm. Hard. Harder than she meant to, I think. He rubbed the spot absently. She pulled me toward her and said she would fix all of it before I ruined everything. Daniel looked down. His voice thinned. That scared me, more than anything she said. That look in her eyes, like she was losing herself. I reached across the table and took his hand. "You do not have to protect her anymore. You only have to tell the truth." He closed his eyes and nodded. A soft knock at the door startled both of us. I stood, heart leaping, but when I looked through the window, I saw a familiar figure, Carmen, my closest friend of nearly 30 years. She held a bag of groceries in one hand, her brows knitted with worry. I opened the door. She stepped inside and immediately pulled me into a hug. I heard, "The police came by my street early this morning asking questions. Are you two all right?" Daniel managed a faint smile. She approached him and touched his arm gently. "You are safe here, honey. Whatever happens next, you have us." He nodded with gratitude, then stepped back to give us space. Carmen lowered her voice. "I brought food, and I talked to a friend of mine who works with a family law attorney. She said if you need connections, she can get you in the same day." The exhaustion of the night threatened to pull tears from me, but I steadied myself. "Thank you. We might need it." As we spoke, Daniel wandered into the living room, sinking into the couch. He looked like someone who had carried a weight for years and finally set it down, only to realize he still felt its impression across his back. Carmen followed my gaze and whispered, He is breaking, and he is trying not to show you how bad it is. I inhaled slowly, I know, but he is here. That is what matters now. She squeezed my arm. Good. Then let us keep him here until this storm passes. Before I could reply, my phone buzzed again, a number I recognized from Child Protective Services. I answered quickly. This is Mary Ann Hill. A calm, professional voice responded. Mrs. Hill, we would like to schedule an emergency meeting with you and your son this afternoon regarding temporary placement of the child and next steps for protective custody. There has been significant escalation overnight. I looked toward Daniel, who watched me anxiously. Yes, we can be available at any time. Good. We will send details shortly. And for now, keep your son close. Keep your doors locked. And do not engage with anyone connected to the other party. When the call ended, Daniel asked, what did they say? They want us this afternoon. They are moving fast because of what happened this morning. He nodded slowly, his shoulders rising and falling with a deep breath. Whatever they need from me, I will do it. Good, because they are going to need your voice and your truth. He nodded again, more firmly this time. Carmen set the grocery bag on the counter and said softly, you two are not alone. If you need me to drive, to sit with you, to speak on your behalf, I will. I met her eyes, grateful for the steadiness she offered. Then I turned back to Daniel. This is the beginning, I said, not the end. He looked toward the window, where the morning sun kept rising, bright and steady, and whispered, I know. I watched the sunlight creep further across the floor, as if time itself was urging us forward. Daniel sat quietly on the couch, hands clasped, his knee bouncing in a steady, anxious rhythm he did not seem aware of. I could see the boy he used to be in that nervous movement, the child who had always bounced his foot before school tests or dentist appointments. It struck me how long he had been managing this fear, reshaping it, hiding it, carrying it alone. We left for the CPS office after lunch. Carmen insisted on driving behind us so we would not walk into anything alone. The building sat on a quiet street not far from the county courthouse, a square brick structure with wide windows that caught the sun. Inside, the halls smelled faintly of coffee and disinfectant. Everything looked too bright and too clean for the kind of stories these rooms usually held. A social worker named Leah met us in a small conference room. She had a gentle manner, steady eyes, and a folder so thick I knew our lives were now printed on half the pages inside it. Daniel sat across from her, gripping the edge of his chair. Leah began carefully. This is a preliminary meeting to discuss the temporary arrangement for your son and the next steps for your case. There has been significant escalation on the other parent's side. We need to address long-term safety for your child as quickly as possible. Daniel nodded, his jaw tight. Leah continued, the relative caring for the child has requested that we move him to a monitored environment until the court hearing. This is standard when a parent exhibits volatile behavior. You will have visitation during this time. Daniel let out a shaky breath. So I cannot take him home yet. Not today, but you will see him later this week. And given the circumstances, it is very likely that temporary custody will be transferred to you. He sat straighter, hope flickering across his face. Leah then looked at me. We will need your support as well. You are listed as his safe residence. If temporary custody is granted, the child will live with you and his father until a more permanent situation is decided. I nodded without hesitation. Whatever he needs. Leah went on to explain the hearings, evaluations, supervised visits, counseling recommendations, every detail necessary to start untangling the mess Sienna and her mother had created. Daniel listened with a seriousness I had not seen in years, asking questions, taking notes, pushing himself to stay present even when the weight of it threatened to pull him under. I felt proud of him in a way that made my chest ache. The meeting lasted nearly 2 hours. When we stepped back outside, The late afternoon sun was warm, and the air smelled faintly of cut grass from a park down the street. Daniel stood on the sidewalk for a moment, breathing slowly, letting the heaviness settle. Carmen squeezed his arm. "You did well in there." He gave her a tired smile. "I hope so." When we returned home, a new voicemail waited on the answering machine. It was from an officer at the precinct. His message was short but clear. There had been another incident with Sienna and her mother. They had attempted to confront the relative again and were detained for disorderly conduct. A judge was now reviewing whether their behavior constituted immediate risk to the child. Daniel sat down at the dining table with a thud. He pressed both hands against his forehead. "This is getting worse." "No," I said softly. "This is what happens when the truth comes into the light. It does not get worse. It gets clearer. And clarity is what protects you and protects that boy." He did not answer, but I saw something settle in his posture, a shift toward acceptance or determination, or maybe both. As evening fell, Carmen stayed to help prepare dinner, a simple meal, just pasta and grilled chicken. But Daniel barely touched his plate. He kept glancing at the window, then at the front door, as though expecting someone to appear and challenge the ground he was finally standing on. When Carmen left, I walked her to the porch. She hugged me and whispered, "He is stronger than he knows. Keep him steady until the court date." Then she got in her car and disappeared down the street. When I returned inside, Daniel was in the living room holding a photo of Jack. It must have fallen out of one of the folders during our meeting. He ran his thumb along the picture, tracing the boy's smile. He looked up. "Mom, can I really do this? Can I raise him without chaos swallowing us whole?" "You already are," I said. "You left. You told the truth. You protected him. Those are the hardest steps." He nodded, then looked toward the window again. The porch light cast a soft glow on the driveway. For the first time in a long while, he did not flinch at the sound of a passing car. Later that night, another call came. Leah again. Her tone gave away the news before her words did. The judge approved the emergency request. Temporary custody will be transferred to Daniel pending the hearing. The child will move to your residence tomorrow afternoon. I turned to Daniel, who was standing only a few feet away. He watched my expression closely, searching for any hint of what had been said. I repeated it to him. His knees seemed to give slightly, and he braced himself on the back of the couch. He whispered, "Tomorrow he is coming home." Yes, he is coming home. Relief washed over him so quickly he had to sit down. He covered his face with both hands. I sat beside him and rubbed his back until the tremble in his shoulders eased. That night, while he slept in the guest room, I lay awake, thinking back through all the years that had led us to this moment. The early warning signs, the quiet apologies, the small bruises explained away, the emotional strain he hid beneath polite smiles, the constant shifting he had done to keep his family balanced on a cliff edge. But now he was stepping away from the cliff, and he was not doing it alone. When morning came, a soft knock sounded at the door. For a moment I feared the worst, but when I opened it, 2 CPS workers stood outside with gentle expressions. Between them was Jack holding a small backpack and a stuffed dinosaur. His eyes found Daniel immediately. "Daddy." Daniel rushed forward and lifted him into his arms, burying his face in the boy's hair. Jack clung to his neck, small arms wrapped tight. It was the kind of reunion that makes the world go quiet. The workers reviewed paperwork, confirmed contacts, then stepped back. "You are his safe place now," one of them said before leaving. "Protect this stability. Courts look closely at who creates calm and who creates chaos." I watched Daniel nod, holding Jack with one arm as if he never intended to let go. The rest of the day passed gently. The house felt different somehow, fuller, steadier. Jack played with a set of blocks in the living room while Daniel sat close by, answering his questions, watching him with a kind of awe I had not seen in years. In the evening, Daniel stepped onto the porch while Jack napped. I joined him. The sky was turning pink over the rooftops and a breeze rustled through the trees. He looked at me. I do not know what happens next, but I know what I will not go back to. Good. That is all you need right now. He exhaled slowly. Thank you for pulling me out of this. Thank you for not giving up. I touched his arm. You pulled yourself out. I just held the door open. We sat quietly for a long moment. The neighborhood was calm, the kind of calm that feels earned. Daniel turned toward me with a faint smile. Mom, I think we are going to be all right. I smiled back. Yes, I think so too. And as the sun dipped below the houses, painting everything in warm light, I felt something inside me settle. Not an ending, not even closure, but a beginning, a real one. If you have been walking through a storm of your own, if you have seen pieces of your story in ours, I hope you stay with this community. Share your thoughts, your experiences, or just your presence. Sometimes a story lights the path for someone else. I would love to hear yours.